Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Deadwood, South Dakota. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the spring of 1853, long before Deadwood would become synonymous with Wild West legend, the settlement was nothing more than a collection of hastily constructed wooden structures scattered along Whitewood Creek. The discovery of gold deposits in the Black Hills had drawn men from across the continent, each carrying dreams of fortune and the desperate hope that fortune might finally favor them. Among these men was Jacob Reddick, whose name would become whispered with a mixture of fear and revulsion throughout the territory for decades to come. The earliest records of Jacob Reddick appear in the Territorial Land Office files, archived in 1868 and later transferred to microfilm storage, where they remained largely forgotten. According to these documents, Reddick arrived in Deadwood in late March of 1853, claiming to be a former railroad surveyor from Pennsylvania. He was described by territorial clerk Samuel Morrison as a man of average height, with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore the permanent stains of someone who had worked with chemicals or dyes. What struck Morrison most, according to his later testimony to territorial authorities, was Reddick's habit of speaking in whispers, as if sharing secrets even during routine business transactions. Reddick initially established a modest claim along a bend in Whitewood Creek, approximately 2 miles upstream from the main settlement. The location was considered less desirable due to its distance from the trading post and the difficulty of transporting equipment to the site. Other prospectors noted that Reddick seemed unconcerned with the practical challenges of his chosen location, instead appearing fixated on the isolation it provided. Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who held the adjacent claim, later told authorities that Reddick would often be seen walking the perimeter of his property at dusk, carrying a surveyor's transit and muttering calculations that seemed to have nothing to do with gold extraction. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with Jacob Reddick became apparent in early May of 1853. According to multiple witness accounts recorded in the territorial archives, Reddick began visiting other claims under the pretense of offering assistance or seeking to purchase equipment. These visits followed a disturbing pattern. Reddick would arrive at a claim when the owner was working alone, engage in seemingly casual conversation about mining techniques, and then make detailed inquiries about the prospector's family background, financial situation, and connections back east. Martha Henderson, who ran the settlement's only boarding house, kept detailed records of her interactions with residents in a leather-bound ledger that was discovered during a building renovation in 1962. Her entries regarding Reddick reveal a growing unease among the community. On May 8th, she wrote, "That Reddick fellow came by again asking about young Peters. Wanted to know if the boy had family expecting him home and how regular his letters are. Something in his manner makes my skin crawl. The way he listens to answers like he's taking inventory." William Peters was 22 years old, having arrived in Deadwood just weeks after Reddick. Unlike many prospectors who came from established families, Peters was an orphan who had worked his way west as a farmhand and railroad laborer. His claim was modest but showed promise, with several successful pan sessions yielding enough gold dust to purchase better equipment. According to Brennan's testimony, Peters was a quiet young man who kept to himself, but was invariably polite and helpful when assistance was needed. On May 15th, Peters failed to appear at the weekly supply pickup at the trading post, an event that served as both business necessity and social gathering for the scattered community. When Peters missed a second consecutive week, several prospectors decided to check on his welfare. What they found at his claim site would haunt the collective memory of Deadwood for generations. Peter's equipment remained exactly where he had left it, with his rocker box still positioned in the creek and his tools arranged neatly beside his tent. The tent itself appeared undisturbed from the outside, with its guy ropes properly secured and no signs of struggle in the surrounding area. However, Peters himself had vanished completely, leaving behind his personal belongings, his accumulated gold dust, and most puzzling of all, his boots placed side by side at the entrance to his tent, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. The search for Peters continued for 3 days, with nearly every able-bodied man in the settlement participating. They combed the creek banks, explored abandoned mine shafts, and followed game trails deep into the surrounding pine forests. No trace of Peters was found, despite the fact that the terrain offered limited options for someone traveling on foot. The searchers noted that the soft earth around Peters' claim showed no unusual tracks, and the creek itself was too shallow and clear to conceal a body. During the search, several disturbing details emerged about Jacob Reddick's recent behavior. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him near Peters' claim on various occasions over the preceding weeks, often during early morning hours when most prospectors were still sleeping. Margaret Kelly, whose husband worked a claim downstream from Peters, told investigators that she had seen Reddick crouch by the creek near Peters' site at dawn on May 14th, the day before Peters was discovered missing. When she called out to him, Reddick had straightened slowly and walked away without acknowledging her greeting. Even more unsettling was the testimony of Joseph Murphy, an experienced prospector who had worked claims throughout California before coming to Deadwood. Murphy stated that on May 13th, he had encountered Reddick walking along the creek trail, carrying what appeared to be a large canvas bundle over his shoulder. When Murphy asked about the bundle, Reddick claimed he was transporting damaged equipment to be repaired. However, Murphy noted that the bundle appeared to move slightly, as if something inside was shifting position, and that Reddick seemed unusually nervous and eager to continue on his way. The territorial authorities were notified of Peters' disappearance, but the nearest law enforcement was stationed over 100 miles away in Fort Laramie. A deputy was dispatched to investigate, but did not arrive until early June, by which time the community had begun to fracture under the weight of suspicion and fear. Some prospectors abandoned their claims entirely, unwilling to remain in an area where a man could simply vanish without explanation. Others formed informal groups for mutual protection, refusing to work their claims alone. Jacob Reddick's response to the investigation was peculiar in its apparent cooperation combined with subtle evasiveness. He voluntarily submitted to questioning and allowed his claim and equipment to be searched. Nothing suspicious was found, and Reddick provided what seemed to be reasonable explanations for his various interactions with Peters. He claimed their conversations had been purely social, motivated by sympathy for a young man working alone so far from any family connections. However, the deputy's report, preserved in the territorial archives, noted several inconsistencies in Reddick's account. Most significantly, Reddick claimed to have last seen Peters on May 11th, but Thomas Brennan testified that he had observed Reddick walking in the direction of Peters' claim on the evening of May 14th. When confronted with this discrepancy, Reddick appeared confused and suggested that Brennan must have been mistaken about the date or might have seen someone else in the fading light. The investigation yielded no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, and with no body discovered and no witnesses to any violent act, the deputy concluded that Peters had likely suffered an accident while exploring the surrounding wilderness. The case was officially classified as a missing person incident, and the deputy returned to Fort Laramie. However, his departure marked the beginning of an even more disturbing chapter in Jacob Reddick's story. Within days of the deputy's departure, strange sounds began emanating from Reddick's claim during the night hours. Multiple witnesses reported hearing what sounded like metal scraping against stone, continuing for hours at a time. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, suggesting some form of excavation work, but they occurred during periods when traditional mining would be impossible due to darkness and the need for careful attention to safety. Thomas Brennan, whose proximity to Reddick's claim made him an unwilling audience to these nocturnal activities, documented the disturbances in a series of letters to his brother in Boston. These letters, discovered among family papers donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1959, provide a chilling account of the escalating situation. In a letter dated June 23rd, Brennan wrote, "The scraping and digging continues every night now. Sometimes I hear what sounds like wooden planks being moved, and once I could swear I heard him talking to someone, though I've never seen another person visit his claim." The mystery deepened when several prospectors reported seeing Reddick purchasing unusual supplies at the trading post. Rather than the typical mining equipment and provisions, he was observed buying large quantities of lime, several rolls of canvas, and an excessive amount of rope. When asked about these purchases by trading post owner Samuel Fletcher, Reddick explained that he was planning to construct a more permanent shelter and improve the drainage around his claim site. Fletcher's suspicions were aroused by Reddick's insistence on conducting these transactions during off-peak hours when fewer people were present, and by his payment method. Rather than using gold dust like most prospectors, Reddick paid with pristine silver coins that seemed inconsistent with the rough conditions and limited resources typical of frontier mining operations. Fletcher later told authorities that the coins appeared to be recently minted and showed no signs of the wear expected from frontier circulation. As summer progressed, the community's unease about Jacob Reddick transformed into active fear and avoidance. Several incidents contributed to this escalating tension, each seemingly minor on its own, but collectively painting a portrait of a man whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and threatening. In early July, Reddick approached Benjamin Walsh, a veteran prospector who'd been working claims in various territories for over a decade. According to Walsh's testimony, preserved in territorial records, Reddick initiated what appeared to be a casual conversation about mining techniques, but gradually steered the discussion toward more personal topics. Reddick seemed particularly interested in Walsh's travel plans and whether he maintained regular correspondence with family members back east. What disturbed Walsh most was Reddick's reaction when told that Walsh was expecting his brother to join him in Deadwood before the end of summer. Reddick's demeanor changed noticeably, and he began asking specific questions about the brother's appearance, travel route, and expected arrival date. When Walsh became uncomfortable with the questioning and attempted to end the conversation, Reddick grabbed his arm and insisted that it would be important for him to meet this brother when he arrived. Walsh's brother, Michael, never reached Deadwood. According to territorial mail records, his last letter was sent from a way station approximately 50 miles east of the settlement. In that letter, dated July 28th, Michael Walsh wrote that he had encountered a helpful fellow traveler who had offered to guide him along a shorter route to Deadwood. The letter was the last communication received from Michael Walsh, and no trace of him was ever found, despite extensive search efforts coordinated with military personnel from Fort Laramie. The pattern of disappearances continued through late summer, with 3 more prospectors vanishing under circumstances that followed a disturbingly similar sequence. Each missing man had been approached by Jacob Reddick in the weeks preceding his disappearance. Each had been subjected to Reddick's peculiar interrogation about family connections and communication patterns, and each had last been seen in areas where Reddick was known to frequent. David Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had traveled west, after completing work on railroad construction, disappeared in early August. Chen was notable for his extreme caution and meticulous record-keeping, maintaining detailed logs of his daily activities and observations. His final journal entry, dated August 7th, mentioned encountering Reddick near the creek and noted, "Strange man asks many questions about my family in California and how often I write letters. His eyes do not match his smile. I will avoid him in future." Chen's claim was found undisturbed 3 days later, with his equipment in perfect order and his accumulated gold dust still secured in its hiding place beneath his sleeping area. Like the others, he had simply vanished without any indication of struggle or flight. However, Chen's disappearance was notable for one additional detail that would prove significant in later events. Margaret Kelly reported seeing a large fire burning at Reddick's claim site on the night of August 7th, the same day Chen was last seen. The fire was unusually intense and persistent, burning for several hours despite the late-season drought that had made most prospectors extremely cautious about open flames. When Kelly's husband investigated the following morning, he found a large area of burned earth and ash, but Reddick claimed he had been disposing of damaged timber from his shelter construction project. The ashes, however, contained fragments that did not appear consistent with construction lumber. Several witnesses noted pieces of what looked like fabric and leather mixed among the burned debris, along with small metal objects that resembled personal items such as buttons or belt buckles. When questioned about these anomalies, Reddick became agitated and accused the community of harassment and unfounded suspicion. By September of 1853, fewer than half the original prospectors remained in the Deadwood area. Those who stayed had formed tight groups for mutual protection and refused to work claims alone or travel the creek trails without companions. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion had effectively paralyzed the settlement's growth and prosperity. It was during this period of heightened tension that Martha Henderson made a discovery that would finally expose the full horror of Jacob Reddick's activities. Henderson had noticed that her supply of preserving salt was being depleted much faster than expected, despite careful rationing for her boarding house operations. After observing her storage area for several nights, she discovered that someone was systematically stealing small amounts of salt during the early morning hours. Following the thief's trail, Henderson discovered that the stolen salt was being transported to Reddick's claim site through a circuitous route that avoided the main trails. More disturbing was her observation that Reddick was using the salt not for food preparation, but for some unknown purpose that involved repeated trips to an area behind his shelter where the earth appeared to have been extensively disturbed and then carefully concealed. Henderson shared her concerns with the remaining community members, and a group of men decided to maintain surveillance of Reddick's activities. What they observed over the following week defied rational explanation and challenged their ability to comprehend the depths of human depravity. Each night, Reddick would emerge from his shelter carrying tools and supplies to the disturbed area behind his claim. He would work methodically for hours, excavating and then carefully refilling sections of earth. The men reported hearing sounds that suggested he was handling heavy objects, along with occasional scraping noises that resembled metal tools working against bone. Thomas Brennan, who had positioned himself closest to Reddick's claim, later testified that on the night of September 15th, he had observed Reddick dragging what appeared to be a large, heavy bundle from his shelter to the excavation site. The bundle was wrapped in canvas and moved in a manner that suggested it contained something solid but irregularly shaped. Most disturbing was Brennan's observation that Reddick seemed to be talking to the bundle as he worked, carrying on a one-sided conversation in tones too low to understand, but clearly directed at the wrapped object. The surveillance team faced a terrible dilemma. Without law enforcement present, they lacked the authority to directly confront Reddick or search his property. However, their growing certainty that he was responsible for the disappearances created a moral obligation to act. After intense discussion, they decided to wait until Reddick left his claim for supplies, then conduct their own investigation of the disturbed area. Their opportunity came on September 18th, when Reddick departed for the trading post carrying several canvas bags that suggested he would be away for an extended period. The men approached his claim with shovels and began carefully excavating the area where they had observed his nocturnal activities. What they found beneath 3 feet of carefully packed earth would haunt their memories for the remainder of their lives. The excavation revealed a carefully organized arrangement of human remains, preserved with salt and lime, and arranged in a manner that suggested systematic dismemberment and storage. Personal effects found among the remains positively identified William Peters, David Chen, Michael Walsh, and 2 other missing prospectors whose disappearances had been attributed to wilderness accidents. However, the most horrifying discovery was not the presence of the remains themselves, but the evidence of how they had been processed and arranged. The bodies showed signs of careful dismemberment with sharp tools, and the bones bore marks consistent with systematic removal of flesh. Some remains appeared to have been partially processed for preservation, while others showed evidence of having been disturbed and re-examined multiple times after burial. Even more disturbing were the personal items found carefully sorted and stored in wooden boxes near the burial site. These included clothing, jewelry, letters from family members, and personal documents, all organized with meticulous attention to detail. Several notebooks were discovered containing what appeared to be detailed records of each victim's personal history, family connections, and physical characteristics, written in Reddick's careful handwriting. The men faced the terrible realization that they had discovered not simply a series of murders, but evidence of systematic stalking and premeditation that suggested Reddick had been planning his victims' deaths for weeks or months before acting. The notebooks contained detailed observations of daily routines, notes about periods when each man would be working alone, and even sketches of the optimal routes for approaching each claim site undetected. When Reddick returned from his supply run that afternoon, he was confronted by the entire remaining population of the settlement. The evidence of his crimes had been carefully documented and preserved, and several men held rifles to ensure he could not flee or resist. However, Reddick's reaction to his exposure was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire horrific episode. Rather than denial, panic, or attempts to escape, Reddick displayed what witnesses described as mild disappointment, as if a carefully planned project had been interrupted at an inconvenient moment. He made no attempt to claim innocence or offer explanations for the evidence found on his property. Instead, he seemed primarily concerned with ensuring that his notebooks and records were handled carefully, warning the men not to damage pages that contained what he described as important observations about human preservation techniques. When asked about his motivations for the murders, Reddick provided answers that revealed a mind completely disconnected from normal human empathy or moral reasoning. He explained that he had come to Deadwood not to prospect for gold, but to conduct what he termed practical research into methods of preserving human specimens for later study. The isolated location and transient population had provided ideal conditions for his work, allowing him to select subjects who would not be immediately missed and to conduct his research without interference. Reddick claimed to have been pursuing this research for several years, moving from location to location as circumstances required. He spoke of his work with the detached enthusiasm of a scholar discussing academic research, showing no recognition that his activities constituted murder or understanding of the suffering he had inflicted on his victims and their families. The confrontation with Reddick revealed additional horrifying details about his methods and motivations. He admitted to approaching potential victims weeks or months before acting, studying their habits and psychological profiles to determine the optimal timing and method for their capture. His questions about family connections had been designed to identify men whose disappearances would attract minimal attention or investigation. The notebook entries, when examined in detail, revealed that Reddick had been documenting not only the practical aspects of his crimes, but also what he perceived as the psychological and physiological responses of his victims during their final moments. These observations were recorded with the same clinical detachment used for his preservation techniques, suggesting a complete inability to recognize the humanity of the people he was torturing and killing. Perhaps most disturbing was Reddick's explanation of his long-term goals. He claimed to be developing a comprehensive manual of human preservation techniques that would eventually be published for the benefit of medical researchers and anatomical studies. In his mind, the murders were justified as necessary sacrifices for the advancement of scientific knowledge, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the community's negative reaction to his work. The men of Deadwood faced a decision that would test their commitment to justice against their desire for immediate resolution. With no law enforcement available and winter approaching, they could not simply hold Reddick indefinitely while waiting for territorial authorities to arrive. However, the magnitude of his crimes demanded something more than frontier vigilante justice. After extensive discussion, the community decided to document every aspect of Reddick's crimes in detail, creating a comprehensive record that could be submitted to territorial authorities for proper legal proceedings. They spent 3 days carefully excavating and cataloguing all physical evidence, copying relevant portions of Reddick's notebooks, and recording testimony from every witness to his suspicious activities. During this process, Reddick remained cooperative and even helpful, seemingly pleased to have an audience for his work. He provided detailed explanations of his techniques and methods, corrected errors in the men's understanding of his activities, and offered suggestions for improving their documentation efforts. His behavior suggested that he viewed the situation as an opportunity to share his research rather than as a criminal investigation. The community's plan to transport Reddick to territorial authorities for proper trial was disrupted by an event that no one had anticipated. On the morning of September 22nd, as final preparations were being made for the journey to Fort Laramie, Reddick was found dead in the makeshift cell where he had been confined. The circumstances of his death were immediately suspicious. Reddick had been secured with rope and confined in a windowless storage room at the trading post, with guards maintaining constant surveillance outside the only door. However, when the morning shift arrived to relieve the night guards, they found the door still locked from the outside, and Reddick's body hanging from a beam, suspended by a rope that should have been impossible for him to access. The investigation of Reddick's death revealed several puzzling anomalies. The rope used for the hanging was different from any found in the trading post, and appeared to be of a type used for marine applications rather than frontier construction. More disturbing was the discovery that Reddick had somehow obtained access to writing materials during the night, despite having been thoroughly searched before confinement. A final document was found beside his body, written in his characteristic careful handwriting, but containing content that differed markedly from his previous analytical tone. The document appeared to be a confession, but one that revealed additional crimes beyond those discovered at his claim site. Reddick detailed a series of similar activities conducted in California, Colorado, and Kansas over the preceding 5 years, suggesting that the Deadwood murders were part of a much larger pattern of systematic killing. The confession also contained references to colleagues and collaborators who shared his research interests, implying that he was part of a larger network of individuals conducting similar activities in other locations. However, these references were vague and provided no specific names or locations that could be investigated by authorities. Most unsettling was the final section of Reddick's confession, which consisted of detailed descriptions of preservation techniques and experimental procedures that had not been discovered among his other notebooks. These descriptions were written with a level of technical precision that suggested extensive prior experience and access to medical or scientific training far beyond what would have been expected from a frontier prospector. The community faced the disturbing possibility that Reddick's death had been arranged by associates who wanted to prevent his testimony from exposing their broader network of activities. However, the isolation of Deadwood made it difficult to understand how such associates could have gained access to the secured building and completed the killing without detection. An alternative explanation emerged from examination of Reddick's personal effects, which revealed evidence of extensive correspondence with individuals in eastern cities. These letters, written in a crude cipher that was eventually decoded, discussed topics related to medical research and specimen preservation in terms that suggested ongoing collaboration with others pursuing similar interests. The letters indicated that Reddick's research in Deadwood was part of a larger project funded by individuals who described themselves as progressive medical researchers, seeking to advance anatomical knowledge through practical experimentation. The correspondence suggested that Reddick's work was being conducted under the supervision of these distant collaborators, who provided financial support and technical guidance in exchange for detailed reports and preserved specimens. The final letter in the collection, dated just weeks before Reddick's exposure, contained instructions for destroying all evidence of the research project if discovery seemed imminent. The letter specifically mentioned protocols for eliminating research personnel who might compromise the broader network through testimony or cooperation with authorities. This correspondence strongly suggested that Reddick's death had indeed been arranged by his collaborators, who had somehow gained access to his confinement location and carried out the killing to protect their identities and ongoing activities. The technical sophistication of the crime, accomplished without detection despite constant surveillance, implied resources and capabilities far beyond those available to local criminals. The men of Deadwood found themselves in a position where they had solved the immediate mystery of the local disappearances, but had uncovered evidence of a much larger and more disturbing conspiracy that extended far beyond their ability to investigate or address. The scope of the implied criminal network was overwhelming for a small frontier community already traumatized by months of fear and violence. After intense discussion, the community decided to submit all evidence to territorial authorities, while also sending copies to federal marshals and eastern law enforcement agencies mentioned in Reddick's correspondence. However, they recognized that the complex and far-reaching nature of the conspiracy made successful prosecution unlikely, especially given the death of the primary witness and the apparent sophistication of his collaborators. The aftermath of the Reddick case marked the effective end of the original Deadwood settlement. Most of the remaining prospectors abandoned their claims and left the area, unwilling to continue living in a place associated with such horror. The few who remained found that the community's cohesion had been permanently damaged by months of suspicion and fear. Martha Henderson closed her boarding house in October of 1853 and returned to her family in Pennsylvania. Her final entry in the guest ledger, dated October 15th, read simply, "Some places hold too much darkness to ever feel safe again. The gold can stay in the ground." Thomas Brennan continued working his claim through the winter, but left for California in the spring of 1854. His letters to family members, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, indicate that he was unable to sleep properly for months after the discovery of Reddick's victims, reporting persistent nightmares and an inability to work alone without experiencing overwhelming anxiety. The trading post remained operational through 1854, but Samuel Fletcher reported dramatic decreases in business as word of the Deadwood murders spread through the territory. Prospectors actively avoided the area, associating it with danger and death rather than opportunity and fortune. Fletcher eventually sold his inventory and building to a cattle rancher who converted the structure for storage purposes. Official response to the Reddick case was limited by the constraints of territorial law enforcement and the complex jurisdictional issues involved. The case file was transferred between multiple agencies over several years, with each organization claiming that other authorities were better positioned to conduct a proper investigation. By 1857, active investigation had been discontinued, and the case was classified as closed due to the death of the primary suspect. However, unofficial investigation continued for decades, driven primarily by family members of victims who refused to accept that their loved ones' deaths would go without further justice. Several private investigators were hired to trace Reddick's background and identify his alleged collaborators, but these efforts were hampered by the limited records available and the apparent sophistication of the criminal network. One significant discovery emerged in 1859, when Philadelphia police, investigating a series of similar disappearances, found correspondence in the home of a suspected medical researcher that referenced the Deadwood research station, and praised Brother Reddick's excellent preservation work. However, the suspect died in police custody under suspicious circumstances before he could be properly questioned about his knowledge of the Deadwood murders. The Philadelphia correspondence suggested that the Deadwood operation had been one of several research stations established in isolated frontier locations where human experimentation could be conducted without detection. References were made to similar facilities in Montana, Oregon, and New Mexico, each apparently operated by individuals with medical or scientific training who had been recruited for their willingness to conduct unethical research. Efforts to investigate these other suspected locations yielded limited results, primarily due to the passage of time and the apparent care taken by the criminal network to eliminate evidence of their activities. In several cases, investigators found that suspected sites had been thoroughly cleaned and abandoned, with no physical evidence remaining to support investigation. The broader implications of the Reddick case extended far beyond the immediate victims and the Deadwood community. The evidence suggested the existence of an organized network of criminals using frontier isolation to conduct systematic murder and experimentation, protected by limited law enforcement capabilities and poor communication between jurisdictions. This realization prompted territorial authorities to implement new protocols for investigating disappearances in remote areas and to establish better coordination between law enforcement agencies across territorial boundaries. However, these improvements came too late to prevent the crimes already committed or to bring justice to most of the perpetrators involved. The legacy of Jacob Reddick's time in Deadwood persisted in ways that extended far beyond official records and legal proceedings. Local Native American tribes, who had traditionally used the Whitewood Creek area for seasonal hunting and gathering, began avoiding the location entirely after 1853. Tribal elders reported that the area carried a spiritual contamination that made it unsuitable for human habitation. This spiritual dimension of the Reddick case reflected broader cultural impacts that could not be addressed through law enforcement or official investigation. The knowledge that systematic torture and murder had been conducted in a specific location created lasting associations that affected how people related to the physical environment for generations. Later attempts to re-establish mining operations in the Deadwood area were consistently unsuccessful, not due to lack of gold deposits, but because of the difficulty in attracting and retaining workers willing to remain in the area. Stories of the Reddick murders had spread throughout the frontier mining community, creating a reputation that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. The psychological impact on survivors extended beyond the immediate trauma of discovering Reddick's crimes. Several of the men involved in the investigation reported long-term effects, including persistent nightmares, inability to work alone in isolated areas, and ongoing hypervigilance that affected their ability to function in frontier environments. Martha Henderson's boarding house ledger, preserved among family papers, contained entries from other settlements where she worked after leaving Deadwood. These entries reveal ongoing anxiety about evaluating the character and intentions of strangers, along with detailed protocols she developed for screening potential guests and identifying warning signs of dangerous behavior. The ripple effects of the case influenced frontier safety practices throughout the territory and beyond. Prospecting communities began implementing formal buddy systems for workers in isolated claims, establishing regular communication schedules, and creating protocols for investigating unexplained absences that differed significantly from previous casual approaches to frontier dangers. Medical and scientific communities also faced scrutiny in the aftermath of the Reddick case, particularly regarding the oversight of research activities and the verification of credentials claimed by individuals seeking access to anatomical specimens or research materials. Several medical schools implemented new procedures for verifying the backgrounds of research associates and monitoring the acquisition and use of human specimens. The correspondence found among Reddick's effects had mentioned progressive medical researchers who were funding his activities, raising questions about the legitimate medical establishment's knowledge of or involvement in unethical research practices. While no direct connections were ever proven, the case prompted increased attention to research ethics and oversight within medical education institutions. Legal scholars also studied the Reddick case as an example of the challenges posed by criminal networks that operated across territorial boundaries with sophisticated planning and resources. The case highlighted gaps in law enforcement coordination and jurisdiction that made investigation and prosecution of complex crimes extremely difficult in frontier environments. These legal analyses contributed to territorial reforms that improved interagency communication and established clearer protocols for investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. However, the effectiveness of these reforms was limited by the vast distances involved and the continued shortage of law enforcement personnel in frontier territories. The Reddick case also became a subject of academic study in the emerging field of criminal psychology, as one of the earliest well-documented examples of systematic serial killing in American frontier history. The detailed notebooks left by Reddick provided unusual insight into the mindset and methodology of an organized killer, though the academic value of this information was complicated by its horrific origin. Researchers noted that Reddick's approach differed significantly from impulsive or opportunistic crimes, displaying instead a level of planning and methodology that suggested psychological factors beyond simple violence or greed. His apparent inability to recognize the humanity of his victims and his clinical approach to documenting their deaths indicated psychological abnormalities that were not well understood at the time. The preservation techniques employed by Reddick also attracted attention from legitimate medical researchers, who recognized that some of his methods represented genuine advances in anatomical preservation that could have legitimate applications if derived through ethical means. This created ethical dilemmas about whether knowledge gained through criminal activity could ever be appropriately used for beneficial purposes. By the early 1860s, the Deadwood area had been largely abandoned as a mining location, with most claims reverting to territorial ownership due to non-payment of fees and taxes. The few structures that remained began to deteriorate rapidly, and the settlement that had once shown promise of becoming a significant frontier town gradually disappeared into the landscape. The physical evidence of Reddick's crimes was systematically destroyed by territorial authorities in 1861, partly to eliminate the possibility of the site becoming a morbid tourist attraction, and partly to address ongoing concerns about the psychological impact on any future residents of the area. The buildings were dismantled, and the excavation sites were filled in and marked with stone cairns as informal memorials. However, the destruction of physical evidence did not eliminate the cultural memory of the Reddick murders, which continued to influence how people understood and responded to dangers in frontier environments. Stories of the case were transmitted orally through mining communities, often becoming embellished or distorted, but maintaining their essential warning function about the need for vigilance and mutual protection. The emergence of Deadwood as a major mining center in the 1870s occurred in a different location along the creek, approximately 10 miles downstream from the original settlement. The new town's founders were aware of the earlier murders, but chose to distinguish their community from the earlier tragedy by selecting a different name and emphasizing the differences in location and population. Even in the new Deadwood, however, stories of Jacob Reddick persisted as cautionary tales told around campfires and in saloons. These stories served important social functions, reinforcing community values about mutual protection and establishing behavioral norms for identifying and responding to potentially dangerous individuals within the community. The cultural impact of the Reddick case extended beyond the immediate frontier environment, influencing Eastern perceptions of frontier life and contributing to popular literature and journalism about the dangers of Western expansion. Several newspaper accounts and magazine articles used the case as evidence of the lawlessness and moral dangers associated with frontier society, though these accounts often emphasized sensational details while ignoring the broader social and psychological factors involved. These popular accounts sometimes portrayed the murders as inevitable consequences of frontier isolation and lack of civilization, rather than as crimes that could occur in any environment where adequate social safeguards were absent. This interpretation served to reinforce existing prejudices about frontier society, while obscuring the more complex lessons about human nature and criminal behavior that the case actually demonstrated. Academic historians who later studied the Reddick case noted that it represented not frontier lawlessness, but rather an early example of organized criminal activity that exploited the limited law enforcement capabilities and poor communication systems characteristic of territorial administration. The sophistication of the criminal network suggested urban planning and resources rather than frontier improvisation. The case also demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated populations to exploitation by individuals with superior education, resources, or social connections who could manipulate community trust and institutional weaknesses for criminal purposes. These patterns would become increasingly relevant as American society became more mobile and complex throughout the later 19th century. Letters and diary entries from the 1860s reveal that survivors of the Deadwood community continued to struggle with questions about how they could have been so completely deceived by Reddick's apparent normalcy. Several wrote about the difficulty of trusting their judgment about other people after learning how thoroughly they had misjudged someone they had lived and worked alongside for months. These psychological impacts reflected broader questions about the nature of evil and the ability of ordinary people to recognize and respond to extraordinary danger. The Reddick case challenged comfortable assumptions about the ability to identify dangerous individuals based on their surface behavior or social presentation. Thomas Brennan's correspondence with family members included extensive speculation about warning signs that might have been overlooked and alternative responses that could have prevented some of the murders. However, his analysis consistently concluded that Reddick's deception had been too complete and his planning too thorough for the community to have realistically prevented his crimes without prior knowledge of his true nature. The final documented reference to Jacob Reddick appears in territorial archives dated 1867, in a report compiled by federal investigators attempting to trace connections between suspected criminal networks operating in multiple Western territories. The report noted that several cases shared characteristics with the Deadwood murders, including systematic targeting of isolated individuals, evidence of medical or scientific knowledge in the treatment of remains, and indications of coordination with distant collaborators. However, the investigation was terminated in 1868 due to lack of resources and the practical difficulties of pursuing leads across vast distances with limited communication capabilities. The final report concluded that while circumstantial evidence suggested the existence of organized criminal networks exploiting frontier conditions, successful prosecution would require investigative resources beyond what territorial authorities could realistically provide. The case files were transferred to federal archives in 1869 and remained largely unexamined until researchers studying frontier crime patterns rediscovered them in 1962. By that time, any surviving perpetrators or witnesses would have been deceased, making further investigation impossible. Modern analysis of the preserved documents has confirmed the sophistication and organization of Reddick's crimes, while raising additional questions about the broader network that apparently supported his activities. The technical knowledge demonstrated in his preservation techniques and the financial resources implied by his correspondence suggest connections to established institutions that were never identified or investigated. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary examination of Reddick's notebooks and correspondence indicates an individual with advanced education, possible medical training, and psychological abnormalities that enabled him to view human beings as research subjects rather than fellow persons. This combination of capabilities and pathology made him particularly dangerous in an environment where his credentials and apparent respectability provided access to vulnerable victims. The Deadwood murders remain one of the most thoroughly documented cases of serial killing in 19th-century American frontier history, providing unique insights into the methods and motivations of organized criminal activity during a period when law enforcement capabilities were severely limited. The case demonstrates both the vulnerability of isolated populations to systematic exploitation and the importance of community vigilance and mutual protection in preventing such crimes. The location where Jacob Reddick conducted his horrific research has never been resettled, despite the discovery of significant gold deposits in the immediate area. Local residents continue to avoid the site, and the few attempts to establish mining operations there have failed due to worker reluctance and equipment difficulties that some attribute to the lingering psychological impact of the murders. The creek that once drew prospectors seeking fortune now flows past abandoned foundations and overgrown excavations, carrying no trace of the horror that occurred along its banks over a century ago. Yet the memory persists in local oral tradition, ensuring that the victims of Jacob Reddick's systematic cruelty are not entirely forgotten. Whether the broader criminal network that apparently supported Reddick's activities ever faced justice remains unknown. The sophisticated coordination and resources demonstrated in the case suggest that such justice, if it occurred at all, would have required investigative capabilities far beyond what 19th-century law enforcement could provide. The files remain archived, a testament to crimes that challenged contemporary understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. In an age when evil was often attributed to passion or desperation, Jacob Reddick represented something far more disturbing: the systematic application of intelligence and education to the torture and murder of innocent people, for no comprehensible purpose beyond intellectual curiosity. Until today, no researcher has attempted to locate the descendants of Reddick's collaborators or to trace the ultimate fate of the criminal network that funded his activities. Perhaps some doors, once closed, should remain that way forever.